By the time Clara Bennett reached the Walker Ranch, she had been turned away from 4 kitchens in 6 days. The 5th woman had not even looked up from her ledger before saying she did not need help. Clara stood at the ranch gate with one worn suitcase in her hand and dust on the hem of her blue dress. Beyond the fence, a boy was carrying a bucket twice as heavy as it should have been. He made it 3 steps before the handle slipped from his fingers. Water spilled across the yard. The boy stared at it for a moment. Then he bent to lift the bucket again. Clara set down her suitcase and crossed the yard without being asked. Together they got the bucket to the pump. The boy nodded once when they were finished. It was the kind of thank you frontier children often gave. Small, honest. A few minutes later, Ethan Walker stepped out of the barn. He was taller than most men in town and carried himself with the steady balance of someone who spent more time working than talking. He looked at the bucket, then at the boy, then at Clara. Nobody spoke for a moment. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek. Clara explained she was looking for work. Ethan listened without interrupting. He glanced toward the house, then toward the barn. Finally, he said the cook had left 2 weeks earlier. The position was temporary. Clara nodded. Temporary was more than she had this morning. By sunset, she was standing alone in the ranch kitchen. The room was plain but orderly. A cast-iron stove, a long wooden table, shelves lined with jars put up for winter. Through the window, she could see Ethan repairing a section of fence while the boy carried nails behind him. There was another child, too. A little girl sitting on the porch steps with a doll missing one button eye. Clara found flour in the pantry and started working. Supper was simple. Beef stew, fresh biscuits, apples cooked slowly with cinnamon. Nothing fancy, just food made with care. The family came in after dark. Boots crossed the floorboards. Chairs scraped against wood. Clara stayed near the stove while they ate. Nobody said much at first. The little girl took a second biscuit, then a third. The boy finished every spoonful of stew. Ethan ate quietly. When the meal was nearly over, he looked down at his plate for a moment. Then he looked toward Clara. "You cook well," he said. It was not praise dressed up for politeness. It was simple truth. Clara lowered her eyes to the dish towel in her hands. For a second, she seemed unsure what to do with the words. Then she answered him honestly. And the moment the answer left her lips, something changed behind Ethan Walker's steady expression. She said she had cooked for people most of her life, but not many had ever noticed. The kitchen went quiet after that. Not the kind of quiet that follows offense, but the kind that settles when something plain has been placed on the table beside the bread and nobody knows yet how to pick it up. Clara folded the dish towel once, then again, keeping her hands busy. Ethan looked back at his plate. He did not apologize for asking. He did not press her for more. He only reached for the last biscuit, broke it in 2, and set the larger half on his daughter's plate. The little girl looked pleased and ate it crumb by crumb. After supper, Clara washed the dishes at the pump behind the house. The boy brought the plates out in 2 careful stacks, saying nothing until the second trip, when he told her his name was Samuel. The little girl came behind him with 1 spoon and announced that she was Ruth. Clara thanked them both as if they had done real work, and Samuel stood a little straighter before going back inside. Ethan came out last with the stew pot. He had already scraped it clean. He set it beside the basin and rolled up his sleeves. Clara told him she could manage. He nodded, but he stayed long enough to carry the full water bucket back to the kitchen. No speech, no fuss, just the weight taken before she had to ask. When the dishes were done, Ethan showed her the small room off the back of the kitchen. It had a narrow bed, a washstand, 1 peg for a dress, and a window looking toward the pasture. The quilt was faded but clean. On the chair sat her suitcase. Someone had carried it in from the gate. Clara looked at it longer then. She meant to. She had slept in storerooms, boarding house corners, and once in a church shed when rain washed out the road. A room with a door felt like more than work, though no one had named it that. Ethan stood in the hall, not stepping inside. "Breakfast starts before sunup," he said. Clara nodded. That suited her. Work was easier than hope. After he left, she sat on the bed without taking off her shoes. Through the thin wall, she heard Ruth ask whether the new cook would still be there in the morning. Ethan answered low, "If she chooses to be." Clara was awake before the first rooster called. The kitchen was still dark, and the house held that thin, cold silence that came before work began. She lit the stove with careful hands, measured coffee, cut yesterday's biscuits, and found a heel of ham wrapped in cloth near the back of the larder. By the time Ethan came in from checking the horses, The room smelled of coffee and warm bread. He stopped at the threshold, not long enough to make a thing of it, only long enough to notice. Samuel came next, hair flattened on one side, boots unlaced, trying to look older than he was. Ruth followed with her doll tucked under one arm. Clara set plates on the table. For plates. Then she saw the fifth chair. It sat at the far end, pushed in neatly, with no place set before it. The wood was polished smoother than the others along the top rail, as if hands had once rested there every day. Clara looked at it only a moment before turning back to the stove. Nobody had told her not to touch it, but the room had. Breakfast passed with little talk. Samuel ate fast and went out to bring kindling. Ruth carried her cup with both hands and left a ring of milk on the table. Ethan wiped it with his thumb before Clara could reach for the cloth. Small thing, done quietly. After the men went to the barn, Clara cleared the table and left the fifth chair exactly where it was. She worked through the morning. Flour bin checked. Ash swept. Pantry jars moved, so the older preserves came forward first. A mouse hole near the dry goods shelf was packed with tin and nailed over. When Ruth's doll lost the rest of its button eye, Clara found black thread in her sewing roll and repaired it near the window. Ruth stood close enough to watch every stitch. That afternoon, Samuel came in with a torn cuff and laid his shirt on the chair nearest Clara, not in her hands, not yet asking. She mended it anyway. At supper, Ethan noticed the sealed mouse hole, the ordered pantry, the doll, the cuff. He said nothing about any of it. But after the children slept, Clara found a fresh stack of split wood beside the kitchen stove and her water bucket already filled. The fifth chair still waited at the end of the table, untouched, holding its quiet place between what this family had lost and what Clara had not yet been invited to become. By the end of the first week, the house had begun to say Clara's name without meaning to. Ruth said it from the porch when her ribbon came loose. Samuel said it from the yard when the biscuit tin was empty, and he thought asking directly sounded too childish. Even the old brown dog that slept beneath the steps started lifting his head when she crossed the threshold, then following her to the wood box, as if she had always known where he liked to be scratched. Clara did not answer these things with softness at first. She answered with work. She tied the ribbon. She filled the tin. She saved the heel of bacon for the dog and pretended not to notice when Ruth saw her do it. On Monday, she washed the kitchen curtains and hung them on the line, where they snapped bright and clean in the prairie wind. On Tuesday, she turned leftover beans into soup and stretched one chicken across two suppers. On Wednesday, she found Ethan's gloves stiff with old mud near the back door, cleaned them, and laid them beside his hat before dawn. He paused when he found them. Then he put them on and went out without a word. But that evening the kitchen knife she had been struggling with was sharpened and set carefully beside the cutting board. That was how the house changed. Not all at once. Not with speeches. A fixed thing answered by another fixed thing. A meal answered by carried water. A mended cuff answered by wood stacked close to the stove. Clara kept her suitcase under the bed, packed except for 2 dresses and her sewing roll. She told herself this was sensible. Temporary work required a woman to stay ready. Still, each night, a little more of her found its way into the room. A clean apron on the peg. A small cake of lavender soap on the washstand. A folded towel Ruth had brought her from the linen chest, solemn as a church offering. The children learned her habits. Samuel stopped leaving his plate half-turned from the table and began carrying it to the basin without being told. Ruth began saving questions until Clara was near enough to hear them. How much salt went in biscuits? Why apples softened faster with the lid on? Whether a doll needed a winter shawl if she never went outside. Clara answered each question as though it mattered. Ethan noticed that most of all. He noticed the way his children stayed in the kitchen after supper now, not rushing away from the silence that used to settle over the table. He noticed the lamp burning longer. He noticed Ruth sleeping with the repaired doll tucked beneath her chin. At the end of the table, the fifth chair remained untouched. Clara never moved it. She never dusted around it carelessly or leaned against it while sweeping. She treated it like a closed door in someone else's house. And because of that, Ethan began to understand that she had manners deeper than politeness. She knew what it was to live beside grief and not demand it explain itself. The first frost came on a Thursday, thin and silver across the pasture grass, and Clara found Samuel in the yard before breakfast trying to mend a harness strap with cold fingers and too much pride. He had the awl in one hand and the torn leather across his knee, but the stitch kept pulling crooked. Clara set the biscuit pan inside the stove, wiped her hands on her apron, and came out without making him ask. She did not take the work from him. She sat on the porch step beside him, showed him how to hold the strap steady against the wood, and let him push the needle through himself. When Ethan came from the barn, he stopped near the gate and watched his son finish the last stitch. Samuel held the strap up, like it was nothing. Ethan looked at the work, then at Clara's hands folded in her lap, and nodded once. That nod stayed with her longer than it should have. The days grew colder after that, and the house grew busier. Clara packed dried apples into jars, counted flour, rendered drippings, and wrote small notes on scraps of paper so nothing spoiled before its time. She taught Ruth to roll dough with the heel of her hand. She taught Samuel to slice kindling thin enough to catch. She learned that Ethan drank his coffee plain, that Ruth hated turnips unless they were mashed with butter, and that Samuel would eat anything if no one watched him decide. In return, the house kept answering her. Ethan fixed the loose latch on her room before the wind could start whining through it at night. Samuel brought in extra water when he saw the kettle empty. Ruth left a smooth river stone on Clara's windowsill because she said the room needed something pretty. Clara kept the stone there. She told herself it was only a child's gift. Still, she dusted around it carefully. One afternoon, a neighbor woman stopped by with 2 shirts needing mending and stood in the kitchen longer than the errand required. Her eyes moved from the clean curtains to the full bread box, from Ruth's combed hair to the stew simmering on the stove. Then she looked at Clara as though measuring where a hired woman ended and something else began. Clara kept her face calm and her hands busy. Ethan came in carrying a sack of feed over one shoulder. He saw the woman standing there. He saw Clara standing straight beside the table. Without asking what had been said, he set the sack down, crossed to the stove, and took the coffee pot from the back burner. He poured Clara a cup first. Only then did he pour one for himself. The neighbor noticed. So did Clara. That evening, Clara worked later than usual, turning old flour sacks into cloths and sewing a winter shawl for Ruth's doll from a scrap of blue wool. The children sat at the table with her, Samuel carving a whistle that did not yet whistle, Ruth watching every stitch. Ethan repaired a bridle near the lamp. The 5th chair stood at the end of the table, untouched. But the silence around it had changed. It no longer emptied the room. It waited inside a room that had begun to fill. The snow held off until the 2nd week of November, but the cold came early and stayed. It crept beneath doors, stiffened the wash on the line, and made the water pump complain each morning before sunrise. Clara learned to keep a kettle near the stove and a shawl over Ruth's chair before the child came down in her nightdress, half awake and looking for warmth. Samuel began leaving his boots closer to the hearth without being told. Ethan said nothing about either habit, but one evening he came in from town with a small bundle wrapped in brown paper and set it near Clara's sewing basket. Inside was a packet of good needles and a spool of strong black thread. He did not wait for thanks. He only hung his coat, washed his hands, and took his place at the table. Clara used the thread that night to mend Samuel's winter coat where the sleeve had begun to tear at the shoulder. The boy stood still while she measured the seam, trying hard not to look pleased that someone had noticed before the tear worsened. Ruth sat on the floor with the old dog and whispered to her doll that Miss Clara could fix most things if you brought them to her carefully. The words reached the room in pieces. Clara kept her eyes on the needle. Ethan heard them too. His hand slowed on the bridle strap he was oiling, then moved again. On Sunday, the storm finally came. Not hard enough to frighten anyone, but steady enough to turn the yard white and pull the world close around the house. Church was missed. The barn work was shortened. Clara made corn cakes and coffee, then set a pot of stew low on the stove so it would last the day. After dinner, Ruth grew quiet in the way children do when memory finds them before they understand it. She stood beside the 5th chair, one hand on the back rail, her doll tucked beneath her chin. Clara saw Ethan look up from the table. Samuel stopped carving. The room waited. Ruth asked if her mother had liked snow. Ethan sat very still. Then he set his cup down. He told her yes. He said her mother used to open the door during the first snow and say the whole ranch had been washed clean in the night. No one moved for a long moment. Clara kept her hands folded in her apron and let the memory have the room. She did not fill the quiet. She did not turn away from it either. When Ruth's face crumpled, Clara only reached for the shawl from the back of the child's chair and wrapped it around her shoulders. Ruth leaned against Clara's side as if she had done it many times before, though she had not. Ethan watched that small leaning. It changed nothing all at once, but it changed what he could no longer pretend not to see. That night, after the children were asleep, Clara found the fifth chair pulled out from the table by 1 inch. Not enough to use, not enough to explain, only enough to show that something closed had begun to loosen. The offer came on a clear morning after 3 days of snowmelt, when the road to town had turned soft and brown beneath the wagon wheels. Mr. Harlan from the hotel stood in the Walker kitchen with his hat in both hands and looked at the bread cooling on the table as if he had found something useful. He said his dining room needed a steady cook before Christmas. Room included. Pay every Saturday. More than Ethan could reasonably offer for temporary ranch work. Clara kept her hands on the edge of the flour sack and listened. Ethan stood by the stove with Ruth behind his leg and Samuel in the doorway, both children quiet in a way that made the room feel smaller. Mr. Harlan said she could start Monday. Clara nodded because a woman who had been turned away often learned to accept a sure thing before it disappeared. After he left, nobody asked her to stay. That was what made it harder. Ethan went back to the barn. Samuel carried wood with his jaw set. Ruth sat at the table and rolled a cold biscuit crumb beneath one finger until it broke apart. Clara worked through the day because work was what a person did when she did not know where to put her feelings. She washed the coffee cups, counted potatoes, folded dry cloths, packed the blue dress from the peg into her suitcase, then took it out again when Ruth came in needing help with a knot in her hair ribbon. The child stood between Clara's knees while Clara untangled the ribbon one careful loop at a time. Ruth did not ask if she was leaving. She only held very still. Near dusk, Samuel came in with a split knuckle from the cold and set it on the table without looking at her. Clara cleaned it, wrapped it in a narrow strip of cloth, and pressed his fingers closed around the bandage so it would hold. He looked at the floor and said the hotel probably had better firewood. Clara smiled a little, but it did not stay. That night, snow began again, softer than before. Ethan was late from the far pasture, and the wind pushed hard enough against the kitchen door to rattle the latch. Clara had already packed half her things. Then Ruth woke coughing from the dry cold, and Samuel came down carrying his sister's blanket, his face pale with worry. Clara did not stop to think. She set her suitcase under the bed, built the fire higher, warmed honey in a spoon, and sat Ruth beside the stove with the shawl wrapped tight around her. Samuel stood close, pretending not to need comfort too. Clara handed him the kettle and let him pour water into the basin because boys that age needed work when fear came near. When Ethan came through the door at last, wet with snow and carrying the smell of cold leather, he found Ruth asleep against Clara's side and Samuel dozing with his head on the table. Clara's packed suitcase was still open in the back room, but the kitchen was warm, the children were settled, and the fifth chair at the end of the table had been pulled out just far enough for someone to sit. For a long while, Ethan did not move. He stood inside the kitchen door with snow melting from his coat sleeves and looked at the three of them in the lamplight. Ruth slept with one hand closed around Clara's apron. Samuel had a blanket over his shoulders that had not been there when Ethan left that morning. The fire was built right. The kettle was full. The bread for morning was already covered with a cloth near the stove. Clara tried to rise, careful not to wake Ruth. But Ethan crossed the room first and took the sleeping child gently into his arms. He carried her to bed, came back for Samuel, and laid the boy under his own quilt without a word. When he returned, Clara was standing beside the table, hands folded, her packed suitcase visible through the open backroom door. Ethan saw it. He looked at the fifth chair, pulled out from the end of the table. Then he went to the shelf near the window and took down a small wooden box Clara had never seen opened. Inside were household coins, folded papers, and a ribbon the color of faded wheat. He moved the ribbon aside with care, took out the wages he owed her, counted them once, and placed the money on the table. Then he added another week's pay beside it. Clara looked at the coins. Ethan took off his hat and set it on the table, not on the hook by the door. That made her look up. He told her Mr. Harlan could pay more. He told her the hotel would likely be easier in some ways and harder in others. Then he pushed the second stack of coins toward her and said this was not payment to leave. It was payment for what she had already given that nobody had properly counted. Clara did not touch it. The lamp moved softly in the draft. Ethan reached for the fifth chair and drew it out the rest of the way. The legs made a plain sound against the floorboards. He set it at the side of the table, between his chair and Ruth's. Not at the end anymore. Not apart. Then he went to the stove, poured coffee into 2 cups, and placed one where the chair now stood. Clara looked at the cup, then at the room she had kept warm while meaning to leave it. Ethan did not ask for her answer. He only stood back, leaving the chair open, and waited as if choice was the one kindness he would not take from her. Clara stood beside the open chair until the coffee stopped steaming so hard. Then she walked to the back room, lifted her blue dress from the suitcase, and hung it on the peg again. She folded the empty suitcase shut and slid it beneath the bed. When she came back, Ethan was still, standing near the stove, giving her the room to decide without crowding the answer. Clara sat in the chair. Nothing grand happened. The roof did not shake. The wind did not stop. But the table looked different with her there. Ethan sat after she did. He reached for the coffee and pushed the sugar bowl closer to her, though she had not asked for it. In the morning, Samuel noticed first. He came into the kitchen with his hair wild and his suspenders twisted, stopped at the table, and looked at the chair beside Ruth's place. Then he set his school slate there while he fixed his boots, as if the place had always been safe for his things. Ruth came next, sleepy and warm from bed, and climbed onto Clara's lap before anyone could tell her breakfast was not ready. Clara held the child with one arm and turned the biscuits with the other. Ethan came in from the barn carrying eggs in his hat. He saw them, paused by the door, and the corner of his mouth moved before he set the eggs on the counter. After breakfast, Clara wrote to Mr. Harlan and declined the hotel position. She sealed the note cleanly, with no apology longer than needed. Work waited. It always did. Samuel carried water. Ruth dusted flour across the table instead of into the bowl. Ethan repaired the porch latch while Clara put beans to soak for supper. By evening, snow had begun again, soft against the windows. For plates were set around the table. For cups. For chairs drawn close. The old fifth chair was no longer at the end, holding grief by itself. It stood where Clara had sat the night before, with Ruth's doll tucked beneath it and Samuel's slate resting against one leg. Ethan waited until Clara brought the bread, then pulled the chair out for her without a word. She sat down among them. The lamp burned steady. The dog settled under the stove. And for the first time in years, every place at the Walker table was filled.